CEO Eleanor Vance was addressing Ethelgard's executives about a severe, embarrassing network security failure. Contract janitor Daniel Hayes pushing his worn cart past the glass wall caused a high-pitched, subtle squeak. She stopped, pointing directly at his faded uniform. This is why standards drop. A lack of focus, a disregard for the silence required at the critical moments of operation, she announced. As the room froze in contempt, a secure, red-flashing satellite phone on her table vibrated. An assistant Miles leaned in, whispering urgently into her ear, causing Eleanor's expression to instantly wither into shock. Daniel Hayes was a single father who had meticulously perfected the art of strategic retreat. In the sprawling, multi-billion-dollar Ethelgard complex, his stability was found in being invisible. He understood the geometry of neglect. The less he was seen, the safer his world remained. Every scheduled shift, every precise cleaning pass, from the executive washrooms to the sensitive server corridors, was calibrated to ensure maximum pay and minimal interaction. His daughter Maya was his North Star, and her homework routine, her school events, and her peace were the only metrics that truly governed his life. He wore the standard issue uniform, intentionally refusing to replace it even as it faded, preferring the anonymity of the worn fabric that allowed him to blend into the background noise of the massive corporation. Eleanor Vance, on the other hand, was the embodiment of visible achievement. As the architect and CEO of Ethelgard, she fundamentally measured human worth by job title, quarterly output, and the sheer audacity of one's ambition. Success, in her view, was an entirely visible, quantifiable hierarchy, and she reigned supreme at the zenith. The company's culture was her direct creation, a high-pressure, relentless, zero-tolerance arena where visible status, the corner office, the expensive suit, the confident projection, was the only acceptable proof of relevance. The janitorial staff, the security guards, the catering teams, they were simply components of the building's functional structure, never contributors to its intellectual capital. The recent catastrophic breach in Ethelgard's network security, currently gripping the executive team, had not only cost the company millions in valuation, but had also, crucially, shattered Eleanor's professional veneer of absolute control. Her nerves were raw, her patience evaporated. She needed a quick, dramatic demonstration of authority, a public sacrifice to reassure the remaining executives that standards would be violently reasserted. The subtle squeak of Daniel's cleaning cart, an accidental intrusion into her carefully constructed theater of command, became the unfortunate focus of her volcanic frustration. She didn't see Daniel, the father. She saw an operational flaw, a symbol of the low-level entropy she expected to be invisible and perfect. She held the microphone like a weapon, pointing directly at him, transforming him into a public exhibit. "Look at the lack of ownership," she repeated, her voice radiating calculated contempt. "If our basic infrastructure standards are this lax, if we allow such unprofessional distractions in our operational hallways, what does it say about our data integrity? Excellence is a top-down mandate. We must eliminate all sources of entropy, physical and procedural. Do not disrupt the mission." Daniel endured the sharp, public shaming. He felt the weight of the collective, powerful eyes focused entirely on his perceived insignificance. Yet his stillness was not fear, it was professional discipline. His mind, honed by years in a far more dangerous arena than this boardroom, was already processing the environment, the body language, and the core problem flickering on the screen. He understood Eleanor's profound arrogance. It was the certainty of the sheltered, the untested leader who had never truly faced an uncontrolled threat. He knew the difference between true systemic failure and a convenient scapegoat. He maintained his silence, refusing to validate her public power play with a defensive reaction. He conserved his mental energy, waiting. The truth, unknown to Eleanor and everyone in the room, was that Daniel's quiet efficiency wasn't learned pushing a mop. It was earned in clandestine theaters of operation. Years ago, before Maya was born, Daniel was a top-tier security analyst and field operative for a highly classified intelligence unit, known internally as the Aegis. His past life demanded absolute precision, instantaneous pattern recognition, and the ability to synthesize complex, disparate data streams under extreme duress. He was a legend among his peers, operating under the highly restricted code name Spectre. His reason for stepping away was not burnout or failure. It was ethical revulsion. The unit's command structure had begun systematically bearing critical operational risks, ignoring irrefutable evidence of a massive vulnerability, to preserve political funding and operational stability. Daniel refused to perpetuate a lie that could lead to catastrophic loss of life. He resigned, burning every bridge, trading global security for the honest, absolute necessity of fatherhood. The man beneath the uniform was still Spectre. His constant, subconscious habit of observing the room, cataloging every exit, analyzing the executive's subtle physical responses, and noting the specific brand and model of the network equipment was an ingrained reflex. It was a signature of the man he used to be and the man he fundamentally remained. He was simply performing his observation while holding a cleaning solution bottle. The meeting resumed, but the atmosphere had thickened, the initial humiliation curdling into a deeper, shared anxiety. Eleanor, having momentarily asserted dominance, was now frantic to address the core crisis, a critical zero-day exploit in their global network infrastructure that threatened to cascade into a permanent operational halt. The core vulnerability, displayed on the massive screen in dense, scrolling red and white code, hinged entirely on a flawed assumption regarding a server's caching capacity and thermal management under prolonged, asynchronous load. The IT director, Peter, a man defined by his carefully cultivated technical jargon, presented his complicated, multi-step mitigation plan. Peter's proposal involved massive traffic rerouting and an emergency firmware update. Daniel, still frozen near the doorway, instantly analyzed the logic presented on the screen. He recognized the flawed premise immediately. Peter's entire plan was founded on the operational specs of the legacy Cisco 800 series cache modules, a fact Daniel knew to be profoundly inaccurate because he was the one who had supervised the disposal of those old, decommissioned servers and meticulously logged the new installations 6 months ago. The new hardware used a proprietary, high-density phased array memory pool, a system with fundamentally different thermal and latency characteristics. Peter was attempting to solve a current, hardware-specific problem using a dangerous, obsolete blueprint. The solution would not mitigate, it would detonate the problem. As Peter droned on, using technical complexity to mask his underlying uncertainty, Eleanor cut him off, her frustration growing with the lack of a clear, immediate fix. She was focused entirely on Peter's delivery, not his facts. She glanced again at Daniel, who had taken a quiet, almost imperceptible step back, his hand resting lightly on the polished steel handle of his cleaning cart, his last point of contact with his chosen anonymity. She felt the urge to reinforce her earlier judgment, to crush any lingering ambiguity about hierarchy. "Peter, thank you for your lengthy opinion," she said, the dismissal heavy and public. Then she fixed her gaze on the janitor. "As I was saying, we do not need opinions from maintenance or anyone else who fundamentally misunderstands the critical nature of this problem. We require high-level accredited analysis. If you are not actively contributing to the solution with verifiable credentials, step away." "Now," she commanded, her voice hardening into a final ultimatum. Daniel felt a sudden, profound surge of professional duty override his fear of exposure. The false assumption, if acted upon, would lead not just to a system lock, but to an irreversible data corruption event, exponentially worse than the current exploit. The cost, the true damage, was astronomical. He took a half-pace forward, his prepared correction, a simple statement about the hardware's heat dissipation curve, ready on his tongue. He could save them. But then the image of Maya's quiet, contented smile flashed in his mind. He remembered the promise of anonymity, the oath he'd taken to leave the shadows behind for stability. He hesitated, his mouth slightly parted. To speak was to reveal the specter reflex. To remain silent was to allow a catastrophe. The executives, caught in the fear of failure and the spectacle of the CEO's rage, carefully avoided looking his way. The invitation for a janitor to speak was unthinkable. His expertise, his life-saving knowledge, was rejected by the uniform he wore. The clock above the screen counted down. The scheduled time for the irreversible implementation of Peter's flawed plan was now less than 5 minutes away. The silence in the room became agonizing, filled with the palpable dread of imminent corporate failure. The high-level executives, unable to challenge Peter's complex jargon and unwilling to contradict Eleanor, simply nodded along, sealing their collective fate. At that moment, the secure phone on Eleanor's table, the one flashing the non-standard emergency red alert, vibrated with a violent, persistent urgency. Miles, the assistant, whose face was already pale from days without sleep, snatched the receiver. He listened for only 3 agonizing seconds. His eyes, usually timid, widened to saucers, reflecting pure, unadulterated terror. He clamped a hand over the receiver, blocking the desperate voice on the line. Miles stumbled toward Eleanor, his movements clumsy with panic, and leaned in, his lips practically touching her ear. He whispered the 2 words, a military-grade code name used only for the highest, most sensitive security contacts, a name whispered only when the protocols had failed and the nation was at risk. His voice was a thin, panicked thread of sound. Eleanor's face, which moments ago was a mask of furious certainty, completely drained of color, turning a sickly, mottled white. She stiffened, holding her breath, her own lips forming the silent, desperate question, Is that truly him? Miles could only manage a slow, terrified nod, his head lowered in a gesture of absolute, chilling affirmation. The corporate power dynamic, momentarily focused on crushing the janitor, was about to shatter and invert completely. The collective breath of the room was held captive by the catastrophic shift in Eleanor Vance's expression. Her eyes, usually darting with aggressive calculation and corporate ambition, were now fixed in a horrified, disbelieving stare at the doorway where Daniel Hayes stood, his cleaning cart a solitary, silent witness a foot away. The whispers had stopped. The air crackled with a silent, profound understanding. Something far greater than corporate crisis had just entered the room, something that bypassed all of Ethelgard's hierarchies and pay grades. Eleanor slowly pulled back from Miles, the secure phone still clutched like a lifeline in her hand. She stared down at the name flickering on the display, a name linked not to corporate mergers or stock performance, but to legendary, off-the-books security operations. It was a name associated with the kind of decisive, high-stakes operational knowledge that made billion-dollar corporations feel like flimsy paper toys. Spectre. It wasn't just a code name. It was a ghost from a time before Ethelgard existed, a shadow from the deep, dark web of national intelligence. She forced herself to stand upright, but the movement was shaky, a profound betrayal of her internal chaos. She looked at Miles, her voice barely audible, confirming the impossible. Are you absolutely certain, Miles? This is the Spectre? The one who went dark 8 years ago? Miles, still trembling, managed a strangled confirmation. The voice on the other end of the secure line was a trusted, high-level intelligence contact who had intercepted Ethelgard's distress signals. The voice had confirmed that Spectre was, inexplicably, on site and, more critically, had already intercepted their active security feed, noting the immediate, fatal flaw in Peter's mitigation plan. The contact, with chilling official urgency, had stressed that Spectre needed to be engaged immediately, without reference to his current assignment or identity. Eleanor slowly, agonizingly, turned, not toward the frantically consulting IT director, but toward the man in the faded navy blue uniform. The transformation in her demeanor was absolute and terrifying to witness. The towering corporate arrogance was violently stripped away, replaced by raw, primal deference, the kind of respect reserved for commanders in an existential crisis. Her hand trembled visibly as she lowered the phone, placing it on the table with unnatural care. She looked Daniel directly in the eye, and for the first time she saw past the janitorial uniform. She saw the coiled, professional stillness beneath it. The word she used, The title she bestowed cut the air like a physical shockwave. "Sir," she said, her voice shaking slightly, but holding the distinct, undeniable weight of a military salute. "Spectre requires your immediate input. You have the floor." The immediate silence was absolute, heavier than the moment of Eleanor's original shaming. The executive's hands, which had been resting on expensive leather pads, were now suspended midair. Peter, the IT director, looked physically ill, suddenly comprehending the sheer magnitude of the secret standing before him. The atmosphere shifted from corporate competition to field command. Eleanor had effectively signed over the keys to her kingdom to the lowest-ranking employee, simply because a higher, unseen authority had given the order. For Daniel, this moment was painful. The anonymity he had fought for, the fragile peace he had built for Maya, was vaporizing. He felt the cold pressure of the past life, the life of Spectre, return, demanding duty over domestic stability. The eyes of the room were no longer looking down on him, but looking up, searching for a directive, a solution that only the man in the faded Navy uniform could provide. He carried the weight of their millions, and the weight of his own broken promise to blend into the shadows. The room, which moments ago had been filled with petty corporate scorn, went utterly, devastatingly silent. The executive team, watching their CEO, a woman who feared nothing, suddenly bow to a janitor, instantly understood two seismic truths. First, that their entire internal command structure had just been rendered obsolete by an external, invisible authority, and second, that the authority was the man they had just publicly mocked. Daniel Hayes stepped away from his cleaning cart. He did not move quickly or dramatically. His pace was measured, his focus absolute. He made no effort to boast, correct Eleanor, or claim his rank. He simply walked toward the massive projection screen, his movements efficient, economic, and focused. The true, undeniable walk of a field commander. He spoke not to the stunned CEO, but directly to the data, his tone flat, even, and purely analytical. "The fundamental assumption is wrong," Daniel stated, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded the room far more effectively than any microphone had. "Peter, you based your entire rollback plan on the legacy 800 series cache specs and thermal load metrics. The actual hardware, which was upgraded 6 months ago, runs a proprietary phased array memory pool with a known undocumented thermal latency under a prolonged differential load." He paused, allowing the technical truth to sink into the stunned silence. He walked right up to the screen, gently taking the dry erase marker from Peter's stunned, lifeless hand. In two sharp, clean, and perfectly placed lines, he drew a small asymmetrical diagram that perfectly illustrated the flaw in the data flow architecture. "Implementing your solution will not mitigate the exploit. It will instantly accelerate the differential load on the new memory pool, forcing a complete L3 cache failure in less than 90 seconds. The system won't roll back. It will enter a critical state, corrupting the primary operational kernel and requiring weeks of recovery." Peter, the IT director, was hyperventilating, furiously tapping on his tablet, desperately trying to integrate Daniel's two facts. The digital model he was running instantly incorporated the corrected hardware specification, the fact he was supposed to know, and the screen flashed a catastrophic, blaring red warning. "System collapse imminent, 68 seconds. The realization was immediate and brutal. Peter's entire plan, costing millions and scheduled to execute in seconds, would have guaranteed Ethelgard's total, permanent operational shutdown. Daniel, the janitor, had identified the critical, logical choke point using only observation and memory, bypassing all the corporate layers of technical analysis and credentialed expertise. Eleanor watched, physically reeling, as the IT director frantically deleted his proposed mitigation code. The immense authority in the room, previously held by the CEO's title and the director's jargon, silently shifted, settling entirely upon the janitor in the worn jacket. Daniel simply returned the marker to the tray. "The assumption is corrected. Now, route the exploit traffic through the legacy backup cluster for a controlled, contained burn. It's an asymmetric strategy that sacrifices a minor processing unit, but it isolates the threat and buys you 48 hours to patch the kernel." He spoke with the quiet, unshakable certainty of a man who dealt in facts and consequences, not status or quarterly reports. The wrong plan was instantly and violently scrapped. Power had definitively shifted axis in the sudden, absolute, and humbling silence of the corporate boardroom. The meeting immediately and violently pivoted into an emergency operational session. The executives, sensing the sudden, monumental shift in authority, began treating Daniel Hayes as the de facto commander, their focus razor-sharp. They peppered him with highly technical questions, addressing him uniformly as Sir or Mr. Hayes. They painstakingly avoided the janitor uniform, focusing solely on the pure, unassailable knowledge it contained. Peter, the IT director, now chastened into humility, was taking notes furiously, accepting Daniel's terse commands with the disciplined obedience of a junior officer. The crisis, though still active, was now under control, steered by the quiet man in the Navy uniform. Crucially, no one, not a single person, dared to re-acknowledge the public shaming that had occurred less than 15 minutes earlier. It was as if the incident had been surgically removed from the collective memory, a desperate shared attempt to preserve the illusion of professional dignity and competence. The moment of contempt was now the unspoken elephant in the room, a ghost of corporate arrogance haunting the successful resolution. Eleanor Vance, the CEO, remained immobile in her chair for a long, agonizing moment. The network was saved. The company's future was secured. But her ego, the foundation of her entire self-identity and her power structure, was utterly frozen, shattered by the weight of her own judgment. She was acutely aware that her public shaming of the man who saved them was not just rude. It was an act of profound, near-fatal corporate incompetence, a failure of judgment that had nearly cost the company everything. Her meticulous, hierarchical worldview had been exposed as a liability, and the janitor's quiet truth had been revealed as the ultimate asset. She sat there staring blankly at the polished mahogany table, consumed by the consequence of her words and the staggering revelation of the codename. She finally forced herself to her feet, moving with the heavy grace of a woman under extreme pressure. Her voice regained some of its resonance, yet it was now laced with a strange, deep humility that the executives had never heard before. "Gentlemen," she announced, cutting off a technical exchange, "we have secured the immediate threat. We need to implement the cluster reroute. But before we continue with our operational update, I am calling an immediate recess of this technical discussion. Daniel, Mr. Hayes, your intervention saved us from a catastrophic, preventable failure that our entire highly paid chain of command was fatally blind to." She paused, facing the humbled room, her eyes seeking Daniel. "I will not, however, allow us to proceed with business until we fundamentally address the procedural and cultural flaw that forced Mr. Hayes to intervene from outside our established and clearly flawed reporting chain." Daniel stepped forward, shaking his head slightly. He refused the expected public praise, the opportunity for a triumphant moment. "My role is irrelevant, ma'am. My request is not about personal recognition or status. It's about operational integrity and risk assessment." He looked across the room at the executives, his gaze steady and unforgiving. "Your problem wasn't a lack of smart people. Peter is clearly intelligent. It was a lack of a reliable pathway for non-credentialed, critical facts to travel upward. The maintenance staff, the janitorial staff, they are embedded observers. They see things your firewalls hide. They know which servers are running hot, which lines are frayed in the subfloor, and which documents are mishandled. You need to formalize a process where observed risk, physical or technical, is instantly and reliably heard, regardless of the observer's uniform or title. Think of it this way," Daniel continued, his voice calm, ensuring the message was absorbed. "Your firewalls are looking for digital cracks, but I am physically tracing the thermal hotspots your sensors ignore. When a maintenance employee reports server rack 37 is running 20 degrees hotter than its twin, a physical observation dismissed as irrelevant facilities noise, that's not a facilities problem. That is an operational risk telling you the hardware integrity is failing, which is the exact precursor to the L3 cache overload we just avoided." The physical entropy I was accused of creating is what I observe and what you are blind to. You must stop separating the floor from the firmware. The people on the ground, the ones you make invisible, are your first and most accurate line of defense against both physical and digital failure. His words were a direct indictment of the company's entire ethos, delivered not with anger, but with the cold scientific truth of an analyst presenting irrefutable data. The executives stared, not at their tablets, but at the polished floor where the distinction between high and low value had just been decisively erased. The executive board, truly chastened by the gravity of the near disaster, immediately agreed. The atmosphere had completely changed. The nervous, contemptuous laughter was gone, replaced by a shared, humbling respect for the man whose existence they had tried to deny. The silent, powerful identity of Spectre had done more than save the network. It had exposed the greater corporate truth that true competence, professional dignity, and life-saving knowledge need no corporate title to stand absolutely firm. The emergency meeting was concluded swiftly, the executives rushing to implement the asymmetric strategy Daniel had proposed. Eleanor scheduled an immediate, comprehensive policy review and a full systems physical and digital audit. The executives filed out, casting a respectful, almost reverent glance at Daniel, who had calmly returned to waiting near the wall, seemingly unbothered by the chaos he had ignited. Eleanor waited until the enormous room was completely empty, illuminated only by the residual, stable glow of the monitors. She walked over to Daniel, her posture now visibly relaxed, less CEO and more profoundly humbled student. She did not bring a camera crew, nor did she offer a grand public announcement of compensation or an immediate promotion. She understood finally that such corporate gestures would only cheapen the profound ethical lesson he had just delivered. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice low, tight, and painfully sincere, "I owe you a deep and unreserved apology. What I said earlier about your standards and your distraction was not only inexcusable and deeply arrogant, but it was also dangerously short-sighted. Your technical assessment was flawless. My judgment of your character, however, was disastrous and prejudiced. You saved my company from an avoidable catastrophe, and in doing so, you educated me about the blindness of my own hierarchy." Daniel Hayes offered a quiet, measured nod, acknowledging the sincerity in her voice. "Accepted, Ms. Vance, the system is secure. That is the only objective that matters to me. I had to intervene because the risk outweighed the cost of exposure." He made no attempt to minimize his achievement, but he also refused to exploit the moment for personal gain. He simply accepted the truth of the situation, maintaining his perfect composure, his dignity entirely self-contained. Within 48 hours, Eleanor followed through on his core request with corporate precision. A new internal protocol was instantly codified, disseminated, and enforced across the entire Ethelgard complex, the Hayes Protocol. It bypassed all middle management. It mandated that any contract staff member, from janitorial to facilities maintenance and catering, who identified a potential physical or procedural risk, had a direct, secured line to the chief operating officer and, in extreme cases, the CEO herself. It was a silent, permanent acknowledgement of the value of true, ground-level observation. Daniel Hayes clipped a fresh waste bag back onto his cleaning cart. He picked up his mop and began the scheduled task of polishing the conference room floor he had been prevented from cleaning earlier. He was a janitor, a single father, returning to the humble, necessary routine of his work. But as he worked, the room's atmosphere was fundamentally different. The silence was not one of neglect, but of profound acknowledgement and respect. He was no longer invisible. Every executive who now passed him in the hallway or saw him pushing his cart saw the man who commanded the room, the man known only by a code name, the man whose quiet, unyielding dignity did not require a suit, a title, or a pedestal. He was the most powerful, truth-seeing person in the building, and all he carried was a mop. His measured, quiet return to anonymity was the final indelible signature of his true lasting worth. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe. Respect changes rooms quietly.